Good morning, everybody. Thank you for talking back to me. My name is Raven. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for using me as your get out of jail free card today. I wanted to say thank you to Hirshhorn for making space for us today, everyone in security, facilities, AV for making sure everything works. And thank you to Amy Bauer here at the Hirshhorn for throwing my name into the hat for today's talk. Also, thank you, Joel, and everybody with Creative Mornings, the volunteers, of course, for hosting these amazing talks and having me here. I guess I'll get started. I was really excited to hear that the theme for this month was muse. It gave me an opportunity to think about that word in a way that I hadn't thought about in a really long time. So here's a working definition of muse that I pulled from the internet. I was excited to revisit this word and think about how it translates to my work in museums today. The muse has a long, storied history within the art world and museums. It's a word that we most likely hear less frequently or less seriously. But in many ways, the muse or muses can be thought of as the ghost of our museum's exhibitions, with the story of how the piece came to be, who the sitter was, and why they were chosen. One of his definitions offered that the muse has been the source of creative inspiration for some of the greatest artists and most iconic works in the art canon, like the renowned Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. But I'd like to ask all of you if, when I say the word muse, if an image like this comes to mind. And I would like you to raise your hand. I see some hands, I see some nods. Okay. Yeah. So this is the kind of image that comes to mind for me as well. This is actually an actual muse of Greek mythology, the muse of tragedy. And so I chose this because it is an image that often comes to mind in the way that we think about the muse. And she's representative of so much. In that definition, she is a part of Greek mythology. She is angelic and an embodiment of womanhood. And she's also white in the way that we think about womanhood. And so it's not an accident that this is the narrative that has been constructed in our minds of the muse. And for me, this image is very representative of the way we think about the museum. This version of the muse is the facade, focused on aesthetics, maybe even highly idealized, and sometimes sanitized. Here we can simply imagine the muse as a young maiden in all her fairness, contained all within this painting. A painting like this stands in for time in many art museums and adds an inside look into the luminary minds of the period and the culture. And so for me, in my work in museums, I think about why an image like this of Sarji, also known as Sarah Bartman, doesn't come to mind. Her life was also part of the period as well in the 18th and 19th century. She certainly was a muse for a heap of characterizations and understandings of Blackness and Black female embodiment. So she's thought to be born in 1789 in South Africa, the Eastern Cape. She belonged to the Khoi group, a tribe in South Africa. She was sold into slavery to a Dutch trader. And that trader found her so fascinating and even quoted as grotesque that he paraded her around the UK in a cage and exhibited her as a show freak in so many words. And so she did that for about 4 years, I want to say. And then that Dutch trader sold her to another trader who paraded her around, exhibited her in Paris for several years. And so she spent much of her life in a cage, exhibited for people, for white patrons, to look at her skin, to look at her unusually sized buttocks, in private parts, and she was considered a freak. And she became the muse for what we call, or what became known as the Hottentot Venus. So you've heard of the Venus, often pictured as a white woman, blonde hair. Several artists have played on this imagery, thinking about Andy Warhol. And so that's the Venus, right? And she became known as the Hottentot Venus. And thinking about a word like Hottentot, what that implies, a kind of Jezebel, a woman who's overly sexualized. And so she became a muse. Images like this began to circulate. You can almost think about like postcards or cards you might get from like a carnivore, things like that. And so Saartjie Baartman was a different kind of muse. And so I wanted to start this conversation really deconstructing this idea of the muse, and I'm glad so many people already touched on this idea of thinking about inspiration, because it's a reminder to all of us and to museums that museums are all a crafted story. We simply choose which version we want to tell and whose voice we want to tell it and give space. And so this work of retelling has been a point of departure for me in museums for a good several years now. Growing up, I grew up outside of Chicago, and we did a field trip to Chicago, and I remember going to the DuSable Museum, which is the African American Museum in south side of Chicago. And going to that museum was just so profound in a way that I didn't realize until years later. At the time, they had an exhibition about, I think, Black entrepreneurs or inventors. And I just remember walking in. Our docent was this Black man with long locks down his back. I had never seen anything like that. And he guides us through the museum exhibitions. And I remember feeling like I was seeing my whole world on a stage. And so having someone like Madam C.J. Walker, one of our first self-made Black millionaires in hair care, and there was just this long braid symbolizing her impact in Black hair care, and that just stuck with me in a way that I still don't know that I have words for. And even then, it wasn't like, oh, I want to work in a museum. I didn't have an understanding of who worked in a museum, what a museum really was, but just that was so important and vital for me in seeing her story preserved in that way. And moving on, again, I wasn't really thinking about museums. Went to college, studied anthropology. It let me not do math, so that worked perfectly. And I just had a general interest in culture, people, language, so it's kind of floating around in the way that college students often do. And my department was really pushing me in this like scientific, biological, and archaeological path. And I don't like to get my hands dirty. I don't like to dig. I don't want to be near bugs. I don't want to be hot. So I'm really pleasant. So I don't want to go on a dig. And so I really had to figure out what worked for me within anthropology of how I could think about people, think about culture in a way that would get me away from being under the sun and digging holes. And so I remember what really changed everything for me is I had completed all of my core classes. I was getting ready to graduate. I think I had 2 more semesters left, and I kind of spaced it out. And I was like, okay, I'll just take like a bunch of electives. And so I ended up taking, I want to say like 2 or 3 Black feminist courses. And what really changed, and actually, let me back up. I was taking a history course, and the professor who was supposed to teach the class got sick or could no longer teach the class. And so the professor that replaced him was actually a Black feminist studies professor. And I just remember the way that she shifted the story and made us think so much more deeply about the narratives that we presented. I was prepared to go in and say, okay, in 19 whatever, 17 whatever, this is what happened, that's what happened. But she really made us interrogate the kind of narratives that were put in front of us. And so from there, I was hooked. I followed her everywhere. And so she was teaching a Black feminist course on popular culture. And I took that with her, and I learned the story of Saartjie Baartman. I learned of the story of so many Black women, but more so I started thinking about representation. I started thinking about culture. I started thinking about race in a way that even as an anthropology major, thinking about people and thinking about the study of people, we hadn't verbally even really discuss racial ideology in the way that could really unpack the systems of race, right? Like in the way that people are not only just classified, it's not just the science, but the way that this has an actual lived impact and consequence on people's lives. And so Black feminist studies really changed that for me and pushed me towards museums in a really interesting way to think about how the stories on the wall could be rearranged so that people like me who go to the museum not expecting anything or not knowing what they're going to see can feel like there's a narrative that reflects themselves, their communities, and so forth. And so moving on, I went to grad school here in DC, which is how I ended up here. And in 2015, I met Amanda Figueroa, a fellow grad student, and we created Brown Girls Museum Blog. And that was born out of a series of frustrations that we both kind of came to together. I was here interning. I won't say the name of the museum, but if you're really interested, it's not hard to find. And yeah, experiencing a lot of aggressions. And I hesitate to call them micro because I think those things add up and they're dangerous. I think, we hold aggression in our body. We hold anxiety in our body, and it's not healthy, right? And so experiencing, stares, being one of the only Black women in the hallway. I'm on the staff level, so people are looking at me like, do you work here? Working with my supervisor, who would often get overlooked by the white male other intern as her supervisor, although she worked there for like over a decade. And really just observing where the stories about me and people who look like me were in the institution and how that really equates to a kind of value, and you internalize that. And myself and Amanda, although we're contending with feeling like outsiders in this institution, we've also come here to go to grad school and pursue higher education. And so now we're also feeling like outsiders in our own community, right? Like I've gone to do anthropology. My family's like, didn't we discover everything already? Like, what are you doing anthropology for? And, I come out here and now I'm doing American studies. That's what I got my master's in. What the heck is that? I still can't tell you. But seriously. Yeah, so here I am with all these nebulous, interests that I'm trying to piece together, right, and navigating. And, now I'm, so far removed from where I came from, a small town outside of Chicago, Amanda being from El Paso, Texas, another small border town, right? And so here we are getting away, what feels like getting away from the politics of where we're from, and, we're subscribing to this Ivy League structure and the academy. And then also, we're in the academy, but we're not feeling at home there either, right? And so we created Brown Girls Museum Blog to really try to reframe that for ourselves, to try to affirm ourselves and give space for what we thought was missing, quite literally in the field in terms of critique, who was reviewing museum exhibitions, who was talking about what it means to have a museum, career. So during my internship, I quite literally looked around into a sea of whiteness. I was in one of our staff meetings, monthly staff meetings, and everybody was on their phone because they were bored. And so I said, okay, well, I'll take a look and see who's talking about museums, who's blogging about museums, because whatever they're talking about on stage isn't interesting. And so I scrolled and, I saw some names and I'm like, okay, seasoned professional, seasoned white professional. And, there's nothing wrong with that. But again, I wasn't seeing my stories reflected. I wasn't seeing someone who understood the lens of, coming from a disadvantaged community and having to figure out how to go to grad school for the first time, how to figure out how to go to college for the first time, and then pick a career that doesn't translate into, dollars and cents to my family. And so that was a lot of the inspiration. But we also wanted to reassert what community looks like, that it's not only about who's there, but it's also about what's on the walls, right? Because again, that's a reflection of, your audience and the kind of messages that they're internalizing. And so again, literally looking around into a sea of whiteness, we wanted to create a space for our stories, but also for emerging thinkers. Again, a lot of the bloggers that were in the space and thinkers had been in the arena for a while. And so museums, as we know, they can be slow to change, but so much is that because we're not having these conversations with the new folks who are coming into the field and thinking about how we can merge some of those ideas. And so part of what Brown Girls Museum Blog became is an incubator. And so now we have Brown Art Inc., which we work on creating institutional partnerships. We work on creating public programming and really thinking about what it means to have a local arts ecosystem. And I want to emphasize that word ecosystem, right? And so over the years, we've been able to explore a kind of new vocabulary and revisited old definitions for diversity, inclusion, placekeeping, engagement, intersectionality, locality, and community. Asking questions like, what does it mean to be in relationship with and among artists, museums, and visitors in a way that is sustainable and equitable? So on the one hand, I'm trying to keep from being like corny, right? Like, community is your muse, right? But also thinking more deeply about like what it actually means to be of a community. And so again, a museum, right? Being of a community, not just in a community. And so museums often claim that community is their source of inspiration, especially with heightened pressure to appeal to diverse audiences and narratives. But these initiatives often come at a disservice for communities of color, under-resourced communities, in the request, as these spaces are often ill-equipped to address the needs and concerns for these communities. And so that looks like accessibility, right? Physical accessibility, linguistic accessibilities, language barriers, financial barriers, right? Like how much is a museum charging to get in? Do they offer free opportunities to visit the museum? Of course, in DC, we have the luxury to go to museums for the most part for free of charge, but a lot of places don't do that. And even hours, right? Like most people work a 9 to 5. If a museum closes at 5:30, like when are you supposed to experience the museum? So how are museums thinking about you being able to actually experience the space? And also, some don't really have an interest, right, in actually pursuing diversity in a meaningful way or acts of redress as they tick off boxes and pat themselves on the back for diversity initiatives and community work. And so currently, I work as a fellow in public programs at the Studio Museum in Harlem. I literally just left DC like a month ago. And so I'm just getting started, but I'm very excited. And I previously worked at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture just across the mall, where I worked in social and digital engagement. And so in both of these positions, I'm constantly faced with the question of what version of the story do we want to tell? And we being the institution, right? And so how do we want to tell it? Whose voice do we want to allow to shine? And who do we want to give space for, like really and truly? And so I have no idea where I am on time. How am I doing? Okay, great. And so I wanted to think about Sarji Bartman again and her work and how I really think about her and women, and women like her, and how her story inspires me to do this work. And so there's a quote from Catherine McKittrick that I'd like to share with you all. She's referring to the classroom, but I want us to think about the museum instead. And so I'm going to read just a little bit, but she says, "I'm not sure what safe learning looks like, because the kinds of questions that need to be and are asked across a range of disciplines and interdisciplines necessarily attend to violence and sadness and the struggle of life. How could teaching narratives of sadness ever, under any circumstance, be safe?" She goes on to say, "It's a fantasy that replicates rather than undoes systems of injustice because it assumes, first, that teaching about anti-colonialism and other isms can be safe." And so I point to this quote for a number of reasons. Again, a museum is not a traditional classroom, right? But it is a kind of way of informal learning. And so for many people, coming into the museum is going to be their first introduction to maybe the art, the stories behind the art, right? Like you can read the label and get so much from that. And going back to my own experience, that was my first instance with learning about Madam C.J. Walker, right? And so there's so much power in that. And I really urge museums, as much as I can, to really reconsider what those stories are, how those stories are presented. And going back to that image of Sarji and the muse, I think we often want to believe that this image is innocent because this is so on the nose, right? Like it points to exactly all those uncomfortable feelings that we get when we see this kind of image of a woman on display. But this image, I would say, is almost more violent. It's not innocent. It speaks so much about the erasure of so many people, but that can often get lost if we don't actually have those conversations. And so I think museums have a powerful opportunity to open up those kinds of conversations. And sometimes it looks like programming. It looks like just having a conversation, urging your audiences to have a conversation. We often feel a little policed in museums as though we can't talk. We have to whisper, right? Can't look up what this means. But really talk to the people next to you. They're probably having the same thoughts, right? Trying to figure out what this piece means. Why is it here? Who created it? What is the museum trying to say? And I urge you to ask those questions to yourself as well. And so I want to begin concluding with this image of Carrie Mae Weems, if you're familiar with the Kitchen Table series, right? Thinking about a seat at a table. Again, I'm trying not to be corny, but it's in the background. But yeah, I want us to go back to thinking about the kinds of work that we do, right? Whatever that is. And so in Catherine McKittrick's quote, thinking about safe space, we often want to make a space safe for us. And so that can often look like ignoring what other people have to say, not wanting to hear other perspectives, and sometimes not even knowing that we're not leaving space open for these kinds of conversations. And so again, safe space can be dangerous if we are not being considerate of who is in the room and what stories, or what voices really, I should say, we haven't allowed to speak. And so I want us all to consider the way that we're inspired to do our work, and to do so in a way that's not only safe for us, but also safe for others, and really consider how we not only make space at the table, but we bring chairs to it, and what that looks like to actually do the work of solidarity. I don't like the word allyship. I consider it to be devoid of a lot of what it really means to do the work of solidarity. And so I like the term solidarity workers instead, to really think about what it means to not just pull someone through the door, but to actually move out of the way. So I'm going to conclude there. Thank you all.